The morning Susanna Fairchild buried her last hope alongside her husband in the red Wyoming soil of 1883, she told herself she would not cry again, and she had kept that promise for 6 months straight, though some nights the keeping of it nearly killed her. The Fairchild homestead sat 12 miles south of Laramie on a stretch of high plains that the wind had claimed long before any human being tried to stake a title on it. The land was beautiful in the way that indifferent things are beautiful, wide and golden in the summer, brutal and white in the winter, with a sky so enormous that standing under it could make a person feel either blessed or crushed, depending on what they carried in their chest. Susanna carried a great deal. She had been carrying it alone since the November morning she found Thomas Fairchild face down in the upper pasture, his heart simply done with its work at 41 years old, leaving behind a wife of 32, 400 acres of half-broken land, 2 horses, a small herd of 30 cattle, a barn in desperate need of new siding, and debts that made the bank's loan officer, a man named Caldwell, visit once a month with the patience of a man who knows eventually he will get what he wants. Thomas had not been a bad man. He had been a dreamer, which on the frontier amounted to nearly the same thing as being unlucky. He had borrowed against the land twice, once to buy the cattle and once to repair the well after it collapsed the first summer, and the combined weight of those notes sat on Susanna's kitchen table like stones. She moved every time she needed the space, and then moved back again because there was nowhere else to put them. She had hired a hand in January, a boy of 19 named Pete Gruder from town, and Pete had been willing enough but had broken his wrist in March trying to control a spooked horse, and when he left to recover at his mother's house in Cheyenne, he did not come back, and Susanna could not blame him. The work was too much for one woman, and everyone in the territory knew it, though no one said it to her face, because she had a look about her that discouraged easy pity. She was not a frail woman. She stood straight and tall at 5 feet and 7 inches, which was remarkable for the time, and she had the kind of dark chestnut hair that got copper-colored in the summer sun, and her eyes were gray-green and direct in a way that some men found challenging and most women found reassuring. She had grown up on a farm in Ohio, had married Thomas at 20, and followed him west with the particular faith of a young woman who has not yet learned that faith requires something more than love to sustain it. She had learned that lesson now. She had learned it in the hard way, the only way the frontier ever taught its lessons. By June of 1883, Susanna Fairchild was doing the work of 3 people and sleeping 6 hours on a good night and 4 hours on most. She was mending fences she barely had the strength to reach, feeding cattle she barely had the feed to sustain, hauling water from the well in buckets that grew heavier each trip because her arms had stopped building muscle weeks ago and had started simply enduring. She was making biscuits every morning before dawn and eating them standing up over the stove because sitting down felt like a luxury she had not earned. Her hands were cracked along the knuckles and her back had a low ache that never fully left, and her boots had worn through at the left heel. And she had not gone into town for 2 weeks because the 12 miles each direction felt like a journey she could not afford the time for. The morning of June the 14th was a Thursday, though the days of the week had stopped meaning much to her months before. She was out behind the barn trying to split wood with an axe whose handle had cracked and been rewrapped in leather strips, and the leather was slipping now, and every third swing the axe twisted in her grip and sent pain shooting up through her wrists. She had been at it for 40 minutes and had a third of the wood she needed, and was sweating through her cotton dress, and her hair was coming loose from its braid, and she stopped and set the axe down and put her hands on her knees and breathed. She was tired bone deep, not the tired that sleep cures. The tired that lives somewhere below the muscles and the bones, down in the place where a person's certainty about things resides, and it was that certainty that had worn thin. She was tired of being certain she could do this. She was tired of performing the confidence that kept her going. She stood there behind her barn with her hands on her knees and the Wyoming wind pulling at her loose hair, and she thought, very quietly and very clearly, that she might have nothing left. She did not say it aloud. She straightened up. She picked the axe back up, and that was when she heard the sound of hooves on the dry road that ran along the northern edge of her property. She came around the side of the barn to look, because strangers on that road were either trouble or nothing at all, and you needed to know which before you committed to going back inside. What she saw was a man on a dark bay horse, moving at an easy walk, heading east along the road. He was leading a second horse, a sorrel, loaded with a bedroll and saddlebags and what looked like a canvas-wrapped bundle of tools. He was not riding the road like a man in a hurry. He was riding it like a man who understood that the road would get him there in its own time. He had broad shoulders and sat his horse the way men sit horses when horses have been a fundamental part of their entire lives, not thinking about it at all, just balanced and easy, and reading the land in front of him with calm brown eyes. He wore a gray hat that had seen considerable weather and a canvas duster that was the color of old pine boards, and his boots were worn but well kept, and he had about a week's worth of dark stubble on a jaw that was sharp and honest-looking. He slowed when he saw her standing there with the axe still in her hand. He pulled up his horse and tipped his hat. "Morning," he said. His voice was the kind of voice that does not need to be loud to reach you. "Morning," she said back, not moving. He looked at the axe. He looked at the half-stacked wood pile behind her. He looked at the fence along the near pasture where 2 of the rails had been lying in the grass for a month. He looked at the barn where the siding on the east face was warped and pulling away from the frame. He took all of this in without making a performance of it, the way a working man notices work, the way a doctor notices injury. "That axe handle's giving you trouble," he said. It was not a question. She looked down at the leather wrapping. "It's manageable." He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who disagrees but is not sure he has the right to say so. Then he said, "My name is Silas Walker. I'm heading to Laramie looking for work. I do carpentry, fencing, general ranch labor. If you have work here, point me to it and I'll start now. You look like you could use a moment's rest." Susanna stared at him. In 6 months of doing everything alone, no one had said anything remotely like that to her. People in town asked how she was managing and then accepted whatever she told them. People from the neighboring ranch, the Haskell outfit 3 miles east, had offered to buy her cattle at a price that suggested they expected her to fail. Her sister back in Ohio had written twice asking her to give up the land and come home. But no one had ridden up and said simply, "Point me to the work." She ought to have been suspicious. She was suspicious. A woman alone on a homestead had earned the right to be suspicious of a strange man on a road. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't. I don't have money to hire anyone." "We can sort out payment later," he said. "Right now that axe handle is going to break on you before noon and you've got a fence railed down in that near pasture. I can see your cattle from here and they're getting restless near that gap." Susanna turned and looked at the pasture. He was right. 3 of her cows were walking the fence line near where the rail had come down, and the remaining rail was barely holding. She turned back and looked at the man on the dark bay horse. She did not know what she was looking for in his face, but she looked for it anyway, and whatever she found there, or whatever she didn't find there, meaning the particular hungry look that bad men get when they're calculating what a woman alone has that they want, made her decision before her mind had fully caught up with it. "The wood needs splitting," she said. "There's a proper axe in the barn, second peg on the left. Fence railed down in the east pasture needs to go back up before those cattle find it. After that I've got siding on the barn east face that's been pulling away for a month." She paused. "I'll feed you, and we can talk about payment when there's time." Something moved in his face that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it. He swung down from the horse in one easy motion, tied both horses to the post near the barn gate, and walked toward the barn without being told where it was. Because anyone could see where it was. Because he was a man who looked at things and understood what he saw. Susanna Fairchild stood for a moment and watched him go. Then she set down the failing axe, went inside, and put the kettle on for the first time in weeks just because she wanted to, not because she had to. His name was Silas Walker, and he was 35 years old, and he had come from Texas by way of New Mexico and Colorado, working his way north with no particular destination in mind, except away from something he did not fully articulate and towards something he had not yet identified. He had been a ranch hand for 15 years, a carpenter for 10 of those same years, because the two skills overlapped comfortably in cattle country, where everything was always in need of building or repairing. He had grown up in East Texas on a small property that had belonged to his father until it stopped belonging to anyone in particular when a dry spell in 1869 broke the family's ability to hold on. He had been 21 then. He had ridden west and not looked back with any great longing. He was not a man who talked about himself extensively. Susanna learned all of this in pieces, over meals and across the distance of the yard as he worked, over the course of the first 3 days because he stayed past the first day, and the second, and by the third it was clear that leaving before the jobs were done would have been a kind of moral failure he was unwilling to commit. He split the wood, all of it, the entire pile, in the first 2 hours of that first Thursday morning using the axe from the barn, which was properly hafted and well balanced, and then he found a piece of white oak in the barn and shaped a new handle for the failing axe while Susanna watched from the kitchen window without meaning to watch. He was methodical. He did not rush. He moved with the particular efficiency of someone who has done hard work long enough to know that doing it well is faster in the long run than doing it fast. He put the fence rail back up before noon. He ate the lunch she brought out to him, biscuits and cold beans and a cup of coffee, sitting on the fence post, and they talked about the cattle, and she told him the situation honestly because she had decided that morning that if she was going to let him stay, she was going to be straight with him. "I have 30 cattle," she said. "That's what's left of 40. I sold 10 in March to make the bank payment. I have until September to make the next payment, and I don't know yet if I'll have it. My husband died in November. He left debts." Silas looked at her steadily. "How much more does the land need before it can support itself?" It was such a practical question that she almost laughed. She liked him for asking it that way, without sympathy, without the pity that made her feel like something that needed to be either fixed or abandoned. "The fencing needs another 2 weeks of work," she said. "The well casing needs to be checked and probably reinforced. The barn needs the east siding replaced, and the hayloft floor has a soft spot I'm afraid of. The cattle need to be moved to the south pasture, but I can't move them alone." He nodded as though she had given him a list of reasonable tasks. "I can do most of that," he said. "The well casing I'll need to take a look at before I promise anything." He ate the last biscuit. "I'll stay through it if you'll have me. I'm not asking for much, a place to put my bedroll and meals." "There's a room in the barn," she said, because she was not going to offer the house and he was not the kind of man who would have expected her to. "Clean hay and a lantern. In the summer it's livable." "That'll do fine," he said. That was how it began, not with romance, not with anything that resembled it, with work which in Susanna Fairchild's world was the most honest language anyone had ever spoken to her. He was up before she was each morning, which startled her the first time she came out at dawn, and found him already at the fence line with tools. She had assumed she would find him sleeping in the way that hired hands sometimes did, stretching the morning into something they could be comfortable in. But Silas Walker rose with the birds and started before light, and when she came out with his coffee, he took it with both hands and a quiet thank you and went right back to work. By the end of the first week, he had completed the east fence, checked the well casing, and determined it needed a new set of interior boards that he could cut and fit himself, repaired the soft spot in the hayloft floor, and begun stripping the warped siding from the east face of the barn. He worked with a focused silence that was comfortable rather than cold. He asked questions when he needed information, and did not ask them when he did not need it, and Susanna found this restful in a way she had not expected. She had been so alone for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to have another person around and had started to believe that she preferred the solitude, that it was a strength she had built. She was learning now that what she had built was endurance, which is different from preference. Having Silas Walker across the yard, or in the barn, or at the table for a meal, did something to the quality of the silence that she had not anticipated. It made the silence softer, less final. On the 8th day, while he was nailing new siding boards to the barn and she was near the garden pulling weeds she should have pulled 3 weeks earlier, she asked him what he was running from. She did not plan to ask it. It came out because the silence had gotten comfortable enough that there was room in it for honest questions. He stopped nailing. He held the board against the barn frame with one hand and turned his head to look at her. He was not offended. He seemed almost relieved. "Nothing dramatic," he said. "There was a woman in Colorado. She chose someone else, which was her right. There was a job that dried up in the same month. I've been on the road since April and I got tired of riding toward nowhere in particular, so I started riding toward somewhere in particular, which was Laramie, because I'd heard they were building and there was work." He turned back to the barn and drove a nail. "I just hadn't gotten there yet." She turned this over in her mind for a while. "I'm sorry about the woman," she said finally. "It's all right," he said, and his voice was steady and true, the voice of a man who had actually made his peace with something rather than just saying so. "I don't think we were right for each other. I think I was comfortable and she was the same for a while, but comfortable isn't the same as right." Susanna was quiet for a moment, pulling weeds. "No," she said, "it isn't." She thought about Thomas then, not with grief but with something more complicated, more honest. Thomas had been comfortable too. Thomas had been familiar and hopeful, and she had loved his dreaming even as it drove them to the edge of ruin. She had not questioned it when she was 20 because at 20 you want to follow someone's dream. At 32 you want someone whose dreams have some foundation in the earth. "What about you?" Silas asked, surprising her because she had not expected him to turn the question back. "My husband died in November," she said. "Heart, he was 41. She kept pulling weeds. I loved him, I miss him, and I'm angry at him about the debts, which I feel terrible about." Silas was quiet for a moment. "That sounds honest," he said. "It is," she said. "It's not particularly flattering, but it's honest." "Grief rarely is," he said. "Flattering, I mean. It's mostly just true." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way she had been carefully not doing for 8 days because looking at him felt like the beginning of something she was not sure she was ready for. He was looking back at her, not in a hungry way, in the way of a man who is beginning to see something clearly. She went back to her weeds. But something had shifted and they both knew it. The way you know a season has changed not because of one day, but because on one particular day you look up and see that the light is different. On the 12th day, Caldwell from the bank came. He arrived in a black buggy in the late afternoon, wearing his good suit and his particular expression of professional patience, and Susanna saw him coming up the road and felt the familiar heaviness settle into her stomach. Silas was working on the well casing and she went to him and told him quietly who was coming and why, and he wiped his hands on a rag and stood up and did not ask her whether she wanted him to stay or go, just stood where he was, which she understood to mean he would do whatever she wanted. "Stay if you don't mind," she said, "but let me do the talking." "Of course," he said. Caldwell stepped down from the buggy with the comfortable authority of a man who handles other people's failures regularly, and has developed a professional kindness about it that is actually worse than cruelty because it is so clearly rehearsed. He shook Susanna's hand and glanced at Silas with a question in his eyes that he was too polished to ask aloud. "This is Silas Walker," Susanna said. "He's working the property." Caldwell noted this and adjusted his expression slightly, which told her something about how he had expected to find her. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said, "I've come to discuss the September payment. I want to make sure you have a plan in place." She walked him to the porch and they sat, and she laid out the plan she had been building in her head for the past several weeks, the plan that had been partly theoretical until Silas arrived and the work started getting done. She would sell 12 cattle in August before the market softened. She had the garden, which would reduce her winter food costs considerably. The hay yield from the south pasture would be sufficient if she got it cut and stored in time, which she now had someone to help with. Caldwell listened with his hands folded in his lap. "That's a reasonable plan," he said, which surprised her, because she had expected resistance. "As long as you have someone reliable to help with the harvest." "I do," she said, and she believed it when she said it, which was itself surprising. After Caldwell left, she went back to where Silas was working on the well casing. He looked up at her. "Manageable," she said. He nodded. He went back to work. That night she made a proper supper for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, salt pork and beans with a corn cake and dried apple preserves she had been saving, and she set the table with 2 plates, and when Silas came in from washing up at the yard pump she said, "Sit down. You've earned a real meal." He hung his hat on the peg by the door as naturally as if he had always done it there, and pulled out the chair and sat down, and they ate in the comfortable way of people who have worked alongside each other and earned each other's company. He told her about Texas, about his mother, who had made preserves the same way Susanna did, with too much cinnamon, which was the right way. About a horse he had owned at 22 that was the best horse he had ever known, and had died in a river crossing in New Mexico on a cold October morning, and he had mourned that horse longer than he had mourned most things. She told him about Ohio, about her father's farm where she had learned to work before she knew it was work, where the seasons had a different character than Wyoming's seasons, softer, more gradual, more forgiving. She told him that Wyoming had taken some getting used to. "Have you gotten used to it?" he asked. She thought about this. "I love it," she said. "That's different from used to it. I love it the way you love something that doesn't love you back, that exists entirely on its own terms. The sky here is unlike anything." She paused. "My husband chose this land because the price was right. I stayed because of the sky." Silas looked at her across the table with those steady brown eyes that had a warmth in them she was noticing more and more. "That's a good reason," he said. They washed the dishes together, her washing and him drying, and she was aware of how domestic this was, and how it did not frighten her the way she thought it might. She was also aware of him standing beside her, of the solid warmth of him, of the way he smelled of sawdust and plain soap, which was a clean and honest smell that did nothing to disturb her, and everything to remind her that she was a living woman who had been conducting herself for 6 months as though she were something closer to a machine. He said good night and took his lantern and went to the barn, and she stood at the kitchen window for longer than was strictly necessary. In the 3rd week, he moved the cattle to the south pasture. This required 2 people on horseback doing coordinated work, and Susanna had not done real ranch work on horseback since before Thomas died, because she had been managing everything on foot. She saddled her mare, a sturdy gray animal named Clover, and watched Silas saddle his dark bay with practiced speed, and they rode out together and worked the cattle with a communication that surprised her by how naturally it developed. He read the herd, and she read him, and they found a rhythm that felt older than 3 weeks, like a vocabulary that had existed between them before they had occasion to use it. They were out for 4 hours in the summer heat, and when they came back and turned the horses out into the paddock and leaned on the paddock fence together to watch the horses roll in the dry dust, both of them sweat-damp and tired in the good clean way of done work, she realized she was happy. It landed on her like a small shock because she had not expected it. Not today, not yet, possibly not for a long time. But there it was, uncomplicated and definite, as real as the fence post under her hands. She did not say it, but she thought he might feel it too because he looked sideways at her with a slight smile that was not his usual careful quarter smile but something fuller, something he did not quite control. "Good work," he said. It was a simple thing, but he said it as though he meant it, as though he were talking about more than the cattle. The 4th week brought trouble in the form of Dale Haskell. Haskell ran the spread 3 miles east, and had been trying to buy Susanna's land since before Thomas was cold in the ground. which she considered a mark against his character, so significant as to define it completely. He was a big man in his mid-40s with the confident manner of someone who has been allowed to have his way for too long, and he arrived on a Tuesday morning with one of his hired men hanging back near the gate, and he stood in Susanna's yard and looked around at the new siding and the repaired fence with an expression that suggested progress on the Fairchild property was personally inconvenient for him. He looked at Silas, who was up on the barn roof checking for loose shingles, with unconcealed displeasure. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said, "I had heard you'd found yourself some help." "Mr. Haskell," she said, keeping her voice level, "what can I do for you?" He launched into a version of his usual proposal. He was prepared to offer her a fair price. The land was too much for a woman alone. She had to be realistic about her situation. And Susanna listened until he was finished because she believed in letting people finish their sentences even when those sentences were insulting. When he stopped, she said, "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Haskell. The answer is no, same as the last 3 times. The land is mine and I intend to keep it." Haskell looked up at the barn roof, where Silas had gone still and quiet in the way of a man who is listening without appearing to. "Your hired man going to stay long enough to see you through?" Haskell asked, and there was something deliberate in how he asked it, something designed to plant a seed of doubt. Susanna met his eyes. "That's between me and Mr. Walker," she said. "Good day to you." When Haskell left, Silas came down from the roof. He did not ask what was said. He had heard it all. He looked at her steadily for a moment. "Is he going to be a problem?" he asked. "He's been a problem for months," she said. "He's the kind of problem that goes away when you give him nothing to work with." "All right," Silas said, and went back up the ladder. But that evening, after supper, when the light was gold and long through the kitchen windows, and they were sitting on the porch in the 2 chairs Thomas had built in the first summer, they fit the porch well, those chairs, and she was glad of them. Silas said carefully, "I want you to know I'm not planning on leaving." She looked at him. "I know that's not my place to say necessarily," he continued, his voice measured and quiet, his eyes on the far hills. "But Haskell put the idea out there, and I wanted to say straight out that I'm not going anywhere unless you send me." She was quiet for a moment, measuring the weight of what he had said. "I'm not sending you," she said. "Good," he said. And there was relief in that one word that told her something she had not yet let herself think directly, but had been feeling at the edges of her days like warmth at the edges of a cold morning. July arrived with heat that made the air above the grass shimmer and sent the cattle to stand in the shade of the cottonwood trees along the creek. Silas had finished the major repairs and shifted to the work of the property's future, reinforcing the south pasture fence to handle the increased cattle load, building a proper storage structure for the hay, digging a drainage trench along the north side of the barn that would prevent the flooding that had damaged the foundation the previous spring. He was also teaching her things, which she had not expected but accepted with the same practicality she brought to everything. He showed her how to evaluate the cattle's health by the condition of their coats and the character of their movement. He showed her a better way to use the splitting axe that saved her arms over the long term. He showed her how to read the weather coming in from the northwest by the color of the clouds at sunset, which was something the old ranchers knew, but no one had ever taught her, because she had always had Thomas to defer to on such things, and Thomas had not been particularly good at weather reading. In exchange, she showed him the land's particular character, where the spring would be unreliable in a dry year and where it would hold, which route was passable in the mud of early spring when the main road turned to a trap, where the best hunting ground was if it ever came to that necessity. She showed him the property's logic, which was intimate knowledge that only time and close attention could build. She had built it over 3 years of living there, and she gave it freely because it felt like the right thing to give to someone who was working so earnestly to preserve what she had built. One afternoon in the middle of July, while she was cutting the pattern for a new shirt from bolt cloth she had finally allowed herself to go to town and buy, She heard him singing to himself out in the yard. She stopped cutting. He had a low, unhurried voice, and he was singing something she half recognized, an old hymn she had heard as a child in Ohio, and he was singing it without performance, the way people sing when they are comfortable and not thinking about being heard. The sound of it came through the open window and moved through the kitchen like something gentle and solid, and Susanna Fairchild, who had kept her promise to herself about not crying for 6 months, felt her eyes sting just barely and had to set down her scissors and breathe. It was not grief. It was not sadness. It was something more like the body recognizing the end of a long absence, like coming in from the cold and feeling your hands begin to warm, which hurts a little before it feels good. She picked up the scissors. She kept cutting. On the 28th of July, he kissed her. It happened in the way that honest things happen, not with planning or build-up or ceremony, but as the natural conclusion of something that had been true for weeks and simply arrived at its time. They were in the barn at the end of the day, hanging tools after a long afternoon of fence work, and she was putting the wire cutters on their peg, and he was hanging the post pounder, and they turned at the same moment in the narrow space between the tool wall and the workbench, and were closer than they had planned, and stood there in that closeness for a moment that was full of everything they had not said. He looked at her with a question in his eyes that was the most honest question anyone had ever asked her. She answered it. He cupped her face in his hands with a gentleness that she would think about for a long time afterward, the gentleness of a man who is careful with things he values. And he kissed her in the golden, dusty light of the barn, with the horses shifting quietly in their stalls and the swallows moving in the rafters. And it was a kiss that tasted like the end of a long solitude and the beginning of something she did not yet have words for but which she intended to know. When they parted, he kept her face in his hands and looked at her. "Susanna," he said, just her name, with so much in it. "Yes," she said, though he had not asked a specific question. It seemed like the right answer anyway. They stood there a little longer. The horses shifted. The light came through the barn cracks in long, flat lines of gold. Then she stepped back and he led her, and they walked to the house together for supper, and things were different in the way that things are different after you have told the truth about something you have been trying not to know. They were careful with each other after that. Not cold, the warmth was constant now, steady and growing, but careful in the way that people are when they understand that what they are holding is valuable and worth the care. There was a particular pleasure in the care itself, in the way he looked at her when she was not looking at him, and she caught it at the edges of her vision, in the way she took a little extra thought with supper, not because she felt she had to, but because she wanted to, in the small adjustments they made to their proximity that were not accidental anymore. He told her more about himself in the evenings on the porch, about the years in Texas, and the work that had shaped him, and the reading he had done in bunkhouses by bad lamplight, which had surprised her pleasantly, because she had not expected him to be a reader, and he clearly was, had opinions about books, and had made his way through more of them than she had. She told him more about herself in return, about Ohio and about her mother, who had died when Susanna was 14, and about how that loss had made her practical in ways she had not chosen. About the books she loved, which were novels from the East, sometimes sensational, and she knew it. He found this delightful. He did not make her feel shallow for it. On the 4th evening of August, he sat beside her on the porch instead of in the second chair, and she leaned into his shoulder, and they watched the stars come out over Wyoming, which took a long time because there were so many of them and the sky was so large. And he said quietly, "I've been trying to figure out what I was riding toward. I think I know now." She smiled into the darkness. "Don't say it yet," she said, because the moment was full and the night was warm and she wanted to let it be what it was without pinning it down too quickly. "All right," he said. He put his arm around her. They sat there until the Milky Way was fully out and the coyote started up somewhere to the north, and neither of them was in any hurry to move. August brought the hay cutting. It was a huge amount of work. 3 weeks of cutting and drying and hauling and stacking that required every hour of daylight, and left them both exhausted and satisfied each evening. They worked in a rhythm that was nearly wordless now, each of them understanding what the other was doing and what they needed and adjusting accordingly. The Haskell men rode by twice and looked at the progress with expressions that told her Haskell had not expected her to be this far along, and she felt a pointed satisfaction at this that she tried not to let show. In the second week of hay cutting, on a day when the heat was exceptional and the work was particularly heavy, Silas stopped at midday and said, "Rest." She kept working. "Susanna." He said her name in the tone he had developed for when he was serious. "Sit down for 15 minutes. You're going to drop." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've been at it since before dawn and the heat is 35 degrees and you're white around the mouth." She stopped. She looked at him. He had sweat soaked through his shirt, and his face was red from the heat, but he was looking at her with the particular expression that combined concern with a complete refusal to accept argument, and she recognized that expression because it was the same one she gave other people and was unaccustomed to receiving. She sat down in the shade of the hay wagon. He brought her a canteen of water from the horse's pack and sat beside her. "Drink," he said. She drank. It was cold from the canvas and tasted like metal, and it was the best thing she had tasted in a while. "You could have died out here this spring," he said, not looking at her, looking at the cut hay drying in the rows. "On your own. Working like this, you know that." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I'm glad I came down that road," he said. She looked at the side of his face, the honest jaw, the corner of his eye. "So am I," she said. And then, because the water had cooled her and the rest had given her space for it, and because it was true and it was time, "I think I love you, Silas." He turned to look at her then, and his expression was the one she had been watching build for 6 weeks, the one she had been carefully not naming, open and certain, and without any of the guard a man puts up when he is not sure of the ground. "I know I love you," he said, with such simple directness that it stopped her heart for one beat. "I've been trying to find the right time to say it. There isn't one. I just love you," she laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, and surprised him too, and then he laughed too, and they sat in the shade of the hay wagon in the August heat of Wyoming with the cut grass smelling sweet around them and laughed at the rightness and improbability of everything. And then she kissed him with the canteen still in her hand and the horses standing patient in their traces, and the hay could wait. The hay did not wait long. They were practical people. They sold 14 cattle in late August, 2 more than planned because the market price was better than expected, and she could afford to thin the herd slightly and invest in better feed for the remaining animals through the winter, which would mean better cattle in the spring. The bank payment was made in full on the 1st of September, and when she put the money on Caldwell's desk, he looked at her with something she chose to interpret as genuine respect and said, "Mrs. Fairchild, I believe you're going to be all right." She felt that deeply going home. On the evening of September the 12th, Silas had been on the property for nearly 3 months, and there was a quality to the days that she could not imagine removing without it feeling like removing something structural. He had become part of the property's function, but more than that, he had become part of its character, the way a sound becomes part of a house, and you only notice it when it stops. She was washing up after supper when he came inside. He did that now, knocked and entered, which was different from the first week when he had waited to be invited, and stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands. She knew him well enough by now to know this posture meant he was going to say something serious. She dried her hands. "Say it," she said. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know it doesn't change anything about my intentions with the work or the property either way. I'm staying regardless." She waited. "Would you want to be married?" he said. "To me, I mean, eventually, not rushed." He looked at his hat and then at her. "I want to be here with you. I want to be here in a way that's real. If you'll have me." Susanna Fairchild looked at this man she had known for 3 months who had arrived on the worst day of a very long bad stretch and said, "Point me to the work and rest a moment," who had been as good as his word in every particular, who worked without complaint and laughed without performance, and loved her with the same honest directness he brought to everything, and she thought about what real was. Real was this kitchen, this farm. The debts that were manageable now, the cattle that were healthy, the barn with its new siding standing tight against what the Wyoming winter was going to bring. Real was the way he sang hymns in the yard when he did not know she was listening. Real was the hay cut and stacked, the well casing solid, the fence lined straight. Real was the feeling she had right now, which was the absence of being alone. Yes, she said, not rushed, but yes. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her properly, both hands in her hair, with the full gravity of what had just been decided, and she held onto his arms and let herself be fully present in it, not managing it or thinking past it, just in it, which was a thing she had not let herself do in longer than she wanted to admit. They were married in October. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher in Laramie, a thin man named Reverend Alton, who had the kind face of someone who has presided over enough frontier weddings to understand their particular mix of practicality and emotion. Susanna wore her best dress, a blue wool that was not a wedding dress but was clean and well-fitted, and the color suited her. And she carried a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that Silas had gotten up early to find along the creek bank, and left on the porch with a note that said "Only for you," which she had pressed into the kitchen Bible afterward. Silas wore his cleanest shirt and his second-best hat, and had shaved that morning with unusual attention. And when she walked toward him in the small church, which was half full of people from Laramie who had come partly out of genuine goodwill and partly out of the frontier community's appetite for any social occasion, he looked at her with an expression that made Reverend Alton smile before he had even begun the words. They said their vows in plain language, the old language, and it fit them well because plain language was what they both believed in. When Reverend Alton said, "You may kiss your bride," Silas took her hands first and held them and looked at her for one long moment with the full weight of his intention. And then he kissed her, and the assembled half-pews made the traditional sound that half-pews make. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the home of Margaret Hadley, who was the nearest thing Susanna had to a friend in Laramie, and who had been quietly delighted by this development for weeks. There was food and a fiddle player and several people danced, and Silas danced with Susanna twice, which was twice more than she had expected, because she had not thought of him as a dancing man, and it turned out he was not an especially natural one, but he was committed to it, which she found more endearing than any natural grace would have been. They drove home in the dark in the wagon with a lantern at the front, and the October air already cool and smelling of autumn. She sat beside him on the wagon bench, and he had one arm around her and the other holding the reins, and they talked quietly about the people at the celebration, about Margaret's excellent cooking, about the fiddle player who had known 3 songs and played all 3 of them repeatedly, and about none of these things at all, really, because the conversation was just the comfortable surface of something much larger moving beneath it. When they pulled up to the homestead, the barn was dark and the house was dark and the sky was entirely stars, and the land was theirs. He helped her down from the wagon and she took his hand and kept it. "Welcome home," she said, and she meant it in both directions. He squeezed her hand and said, "Thank you for letting me come home," and she understood that this was about more than tonight, was about the whole of the past 4 months, and she pulled him toward the house. They wintered well. That was not nothing on the Wyoming high plains in 1883, where winters could be tests of endurance that broke homesteads that had survived everything else. The hay was sufficient. The cattle were in good condition going into the cold, and the barn held warmth well with the new siding. They had put up enough preserves and dried goods to be comfortable through even a long, hard winter without desperate trips to town. The winter also gave them something that the relentless work of the summer and fall had not: time. Time in the evenings by the stove with a book or a conversation, time on Sundays when the light was good and the work was managed, and they could simply be in the house together without the pressure of undone things pulling at them. Silas turned out to read aloud very well, with an easy cadence that made the novels she liked more interesting than they were on the page. And she embroidered while he read and was at peace in a way she had not been at peace in years. He was a good man in the close quarters of a small house in winter, which is the real test of a person's character in a way that summer work is not. He was not moody. He was not demanding. He was not the kind of man who made his presence in a room feel like an imposition on her freedom. He moved through the house with a natural consideration, which was not a learned politeness but seemed genuine, as though other people's ease simply mattered to him. She told him one February evening, when the snow was deep outside and the fire was high, and he had just finished a chapter of something they had sent away to Cheyenne for. "I want you to know that I'm happy. I don't say it enough, and I want you to know it." He closed the book and looked at her with those warm brown eyes that she had long since stopped trying not to be moved by. "I know," he said. "I can tell, but it's good to hear." "Can you tell?" she asked, genuinely curious. "The way you moved that first morning," he said. "When I first saw you, you were carrying something so heavy it was changing the way you stood. You don't stand like that anymore." She thought about that. "No," she said. "I don't." "That's enough for me," he said. "That right there." She set down her embroidery and went to him, and he made room for her beside him on the settle, and she tucked herself against him with his arm around her and the fire talking to itself in the stove, and outside the snow fell on Wyoming with complete indifference, and inside the Fairchild house was warm and full of what had been missing. March brought the mud and the particular restlessness of a land trying to decide if winter was over. And with it came news from Laramie that Dale Haskell had overextended himself in the fall, buying up 2 properties east of town that had turned out to be in worse condition than he realized, and that the bank was calling in one of his notes. He was not ruined, but he was humbled, and Susanna heard this with a careful neutrality that she then abandoned in the privacy of the kitchen to feel a very human satisfaction, which she confessed to Silas, who received it without judgment and shared it quietly. "I feel badly feeling pleased about it," she said. "No, you don't," he said, not unkindly. "He tried to buy your land 3 times while you were grieving. You're allowed to feel what you feel." "He won't come around anymore," she said. "No," Silas agreed. "I don't think he will." He was right. Haskell redirected his ambitions elsewhere, and the road past the Fairchild property became quiet again. That spring they expanded. Not recklessly, not in the way that Thomas had expanded with borrowed money and large hope, in the measured way of people who had done the math and knew their land. They added 10 cattle, bringing the herd to 36, which was the number the south pasture could reasonably sustain. They planted a larger kitchen garden, which Susanna managed with the pleasure she had discovered she took in growing things. Silas built her a greenhouse frame from timber and glass he salvaged from a collapsed building east of Laramie, which was ambitious and uncertain, and she did not expect it to work. And it worked, and she grew tomatoes in Wyoming in May, which she considered one of the finest achievements of her life. He also built 2 more pieces of furniture for the house, a proper writing desk for the corner of the parlor where she had been balancing letters on her knee, and a rocking chair for the porch that paired with the one Thomas had built, so that the porch had its 2 chairs again, and they were used every evening the weather allowed. One evening in May, on the porch in the new rocking chair, she told him she was going to have a child. She said it quietly and directly, which was her manner with important things, and watched his face. What moved across it was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. It began with stillness and then became a kind of light, the specific illumination of someone receiving something they had hoped for but had not known they were allowed to want, and he reached across and took her hand from the arm of the chair with the same careful gentleness that had characterized him from the beginning, and held it. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first question, the right first question. "I'm very well," she said. "When?" "December, I think, the end of November, maybe." He looked out at the Wyoming evening, at the sky that was doing something extraordinary in shades of copper and rose, and then back at her. "I don't have the words for this," he said. "I want you to know that." "You don't need them," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed it to his lips, and they sat like that for a while with the rocking chairs moving gently and the evening birds settling into the cottonwoods along the creek and the cattle moving in the south pasture. And the land was theirs, and the sky was enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and they were not. The summer of 1884 passed in a warmth that was different in character from the previous summer, which had been driven by necessity and relief. This summer had a fullness to it, a sense of things not just surviving but genuinely flourishing. The cattle were healthy. The garden was abundant beyond their ability to eat fresh, so she spent August putting things up, and the pantry shelves filled with a satisfying density. Silas painted the farmhouse exterior, which had not been painted since before Thomas's death, a clean white that made the whole property look intentional and cared for in a way that pleased her every time she came back across the fields and saw it. The neighbors took note. The Harlow family, who had homesteaded 6 miles north the previous year, rode by in July and stopped to introduce themselves, and Susanna liked Ellen Harlow immediately. A compact woman about her own age with capable hands and an honest laugh, and they developed a friendship in the easy way that frontier women develop friendships, quickly and practically, because the distances are too great to be slowly warming toward anything. In September, a letter arrived from Susanna's sister Clara in Ohio. It was a long letter, longer than usual, and it began with the expected news of the family and the farm back east and then turned to a subject that stopped Susanna. Clara's husband had died in the spring of a fever. Clara was alone on the farm. Clara was not managing. Susanna read the letter twice. Then she read it to Silas that evening. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She looked at her hands in her lap. "I want to bring her here," she said. "If she wants to come, I can't leave and go to her, not now and not when the baby comes. But if she could come here, there's the room off the parlor that's barely used and the work would be good for her, and I could use her when the baby comes." "Then write and ask her," he said simply. She looked at him. "It would change things here, having another person." "Not the things that matter," he said. She wrote the letter the next morning. Clara's response came in October and was a single page of relief that was almost painful to read. She would come in November before the hard winter set in. Susanna and Silas made the parlor room comfortable, and Silas built a second bed frame with a care that told Susanna he understood that the guest was not a guest but a sister in grief, and that mattered. Clara arrived on the 14th of November on the Laramie stage, thinner than Susanna remembered, and with a careful look about her that she recognized from the inside, the look of someone managing what they cannot yet afford to feel fully. Silas picked her up from town in the wagon, and when he brought her to the house, Clara stood in the yard and looked at the white-painted house and the tight barn and the good fence lines and the winter sky above it all and said to Susanna, "Oh, you really did build something here," with a wonder that was partly for Susanna and partly, Susanna thought, for herself, for the possibility of building things. Clara was 30 years old and had been married at 22 and had no children, and had spent 8 years keeping a farm with a man who had not been unkind, but had not been especially present either, and now was at 30 genuinely beginning, which was frightening, and which the Wyoming sky seemed to suit somehow. She and Silas established an easy, uncomplicated friendship built on shared practical purpose, which was a relief to Susanna, who had briefly worried about the dynamics and did not worry about them after the first week. The baby came in late November, exactly as Susanna had calculated, on a cold, clear night when the stars were very bright, with Clara's help and later the help of the Laramie midwife, who arrived in the small hours of the morning, having been sent for by Silas on a hard night ride that he made without hesitation. It was a long labor and a difficult one, but Susanna was not a woman who surrendered to difficulty, and she and the midwife and Clara between them brought the child into the world in the gray light before dawn on a Tuesday morning in the 21st of November, 1884. It was a boy. He weighed a great deal, or seemed to, and he announced his arrival with extraordinary volume, which the midwife said was an excellent sign, and which made Silas, who had been waiting in the kitchen through the longest night of his life, press his forehead against the kitchen door frame and breathe. Susanna heard him exhale from the bedroom and said, "Silas." He opened the door and came in, hat in his hand, and she was lying in the bed with the baby wrapped in the blue-striped cloth Clara had made, and she looked at him, and her face was exhausted and luminous in the way of people who have just come through something immense. And he sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son for the first time with the careful gravity of someone who understands that they are holding something that cannot be replaced. "Thomas Henry Walker," Susanna said. "Henry was my father's name. Thomas because he deserves something, the land and all of this, even if he made some bad decisions." Silas looked at the baby with the complete attention of a man who has nowhere else in the world to be. "Thomas Henry Walker," he said. "That's a good name." "It is," she said. Clara made breakfast that morning, something elaborate with eggs and salt pork and the last of the preserved tomatoes, and they all ate it in the kitchen, Susanna propped up in the bed with her plate, and the baby asleep in the cradle Silas had built in the fall, and the midwife stayed for coffee and said the child was fine and the mother was fine, and the father looked like he needed to sleep, which made Clara laugh. The winter passed with a new fullness to it, the particular fullness of a house with an infant, which was exhausting and unpredictable, and so deeply good that Susanna sometimes stood in the kitchen at dawn feeding Thomas Henry, while the rest of the house slept and felt, in the blue-gray light with the baby's warmth against her, that she had arrived at something she had been traveling toward without knowing where she was going. Silas was an exceptional father in the plain and fundamental ways that matter most. He was not afraid of the baby, which surprised her slightly, though she did not say why. He held Thomas Henry with confidence from the beginning, and got up in the night without being asked, and had the particular patience with infant uncertainty that speaks of a person with deep wells of steadiness. He sang to the baby, which was how she first confirmed what she had suspected from that early morning in the yard, that his voice was genuinely beautiful in a plain and undecorated way, like honest work. Clara bloomed slowly through the winter. She was helpful in the way that grief sometimes makes people helpful, busyness as restoration, and she and Susanna fell back into the easy language of sisters who had been apart and found they had not lost it. By February she was looking better, sleeping better, and had begun to talk about what she wanted her life to become, which was a conversation that was itself recovery. A young man from town came to call in the spring. His name was Robert Finch, and he worked at the general store in Laramie and had seen Clara at church on the 3 Sundays she had come to town with Susanna, and he was 28 and steady, and had the honest, uncalculating manner of someone who is simply attracted to a person without any agenda about it. Clara told Susanna about the first visit with a careful neutrality that did not fool Susanna at all, and Susanna said, "He seems decent," and Clara said, "He does, doesn't he?" and that was that. Spring of 1885 came early and generous, with rain at the right intervals and the grass coming in thick on both pastures. The cattle herd had done well through the winter with only one loss, an older cow who had been weakening since the fall, and Silas had already identified 3 calves among the herd's natural increase that would bring good prices in the summer, or be retained to grow the herd further. They were in the south pasture on an April afternoon, both of them checking the fence line after the winter, Thomas Henry in the carrier that Silas had constructed from canvas and wood, and which the baby regarded as satisfactory as long as someone was moving, when Susanna stopped at the corner post and looked out at the land. It was a clear afternoon, and from this corner you could see both pastures and the barn and the white house and the creek line with its cottonwoods just beginning to leaf out green, and beyond all of it the hills running up toward the mountains that were still snow-capped, and the sky above everything tremendous and particular in hers. Silas came to stand beside her. Thomas Henry was asleep in the carrier, one fist against his cheek. I was going to lose this, Susanna said quietly, not in grief, in acknowledgement. A year ago I was standing behind that barn with a broken axe and 30 cattle and the bank breathing down my neck, and I was so tired I couldn't see past that day. I know, he said. He did not minimize it. And then you came down the road, she said. I came down the road, he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her in the way she had come to know as his most honest way of looking, with everything quiet in him and his full attention on her, and she reached up and touched his jaw with her palm, and he leaned into it the way he always did, which still moved her after 18 months. I love you, she said. I want to say it all the time, and I'm not always good at saying it. You say it in every way except the words, he said, and those are the better ways. He turned his head to press his lips to her palm. But the words are good too. She laughed, and Thomas Henry stirred and made a small noise, and they both looked at him, and then at each other, and the afternoon was gold and wide and entirely theirs. Clara married Robert Finch in June of that year in a simple ceremony at the church in Laramie, with Susanna and Silas as witnesses. It was a warm day, and Robert looked at Clara the way that straightforward men look at the people they intend to spend their lives with, steadily, with conviction. And Clara looked back at him with the tentative brightness of someone stepping back into the light after a long indoor time. They planned to stay in Laramie, where Robert had a stable position and where Clara was close to Susanna, which was what both sisters wanted. By midsummer of 1885, the Fairchild land Walker land now by every practical measure, though the deed had been changed to Silas and Susanna Walker when they married, and Susanna had felt the rightness of her name becoming Walker without any grief for what she was releasing, because what she was releasing was the last tether of a difficult time, was the best it had ever been. The herd stood at 42 head after the spring calves. The barn was sound and full of good equipment. The house was expanded by a room that Silas had framed and enclosed the previous fall, a proper bedroom for Thomas Henry that would do until he was old enough to want the full interior of it. The greenhouse produced tomatoes and peppers and herbs through the shoulder seasons. The kitchen garden was the talk of Ellen Harlow, who came by every few weeks and always left with something from it. Caldwell from the bank stopped by in August, not to discuss a note, but to say hello, which was a different kind of visit entirely. He shook Silas's hand with the genuine respect of a man who has watched someone succeed against real odds and knows the difference between luck and work. "You've done a fine thing with this property," he said, and it was plural because he meant both of them. The bank note had been paid off in full that July, the final payment made with the proceeds from the summer cattle sale and a surplus from the hay operation, which Silas had expanded the previous year by taking on a contract to supply hay to the Laramie livery stable through the winter. The note was paid and the land was free, and when Susanna burned the copy of it in the kitchen stove that evening, she did it in a ceremony of one with a cup of good coffee and let herself feel the weight of what it meant. Free. The land was free. They were free. She told Silas when he came in from the barn, and he looked at her face and knew what had happened before she said it. He crossed the kitchen and held her, just held her, for a long moment without saying anything, and she pressed her face against his neck and breathed him in and let herself be held fully, which had been one of the things she had learned in their time together, to receive being held with the same completeness she gave it. That fall Susanna discovered she was expecting again. She told Silas on the porch in the October evening, which was where it seemed the important things were told, and he received it with the same illuminated stillness as the first time, which she found privately charming, that he had not gotten accustomed to joy but met it fresh each time. "You seem surprised," she said. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm grateful. There's a difference." She thought about that. "Yes," she said, "I suppose there is." Thomas Henry, who was nearly a year old and had recently discovered that he was a person with opinions about things, was sitting between them on the porch boards, chewing on a wooden spool and regarding the evening cattle with the serious attention of someone with pastoral ambitions. "He's going to be a rancher," Silas said. He's going to be whatever he wants, Susanna said. Those are compatible, Silas said mildly. She smiled and leaned against his shoulder, and they watched the cattle in the last light, and the stars beginning to show in the east, and the land settling into itself for another Wyoming night. The second baby came in the early spring of 1886, a girl this time, born in March with the first warmth beginning to arrive. And she came into the world with less drama than her brother, but with an equal volume of announcement, and an alertness that the midwife noted approvingly. They named her Ruth Ellen Walker Ellen for Ellen Harlow, who had been a true and practical friend through both pregnancies, and Ruth because Susanna had always loved the name for its connotations of fidelity, of following where one is led because love requires it. Ruth Ellen had dark hair like her mother and her father's calm brown eyes, and from the beginning a quality of observation that made Susanna suspect. She was taking everything in and filing it away, which was either the making of a thoughtful person or a troublemaker, and possibly both. Clara and Robert came to see the new baby in April with a shyness about them that resolved itself when Clara took the baby and held her and looked up at Susanna over Ruth Ellen's dark head with wet eyes. "She's perfect," Clara said. Robert put his hand on Clara's back, the comfortable, quiet gesture of a man who knows his wife. They were expecting two, they said, and Susanna stood up from the chair and embraced her sister with the baby still between them and felt the long arc of things, the distance from that November in Ohio when their mother died and they were girls learning to manage loss, to this Wyoming spring when they were both 35 and 34 and full of life they had built themselves. The summer of 1886 was the most beautiful summer Susanna could remember on the Wyoming high plains, though she was aware that beauty is partly a product of what you are standing in. She was standing in a life that fit her. She was standing in work that was hers and love that was real, and a land she had earned by refusing to leave it. And Thomas Henry was walking and investigating everything with the focused intensity of a child who believes that understanding is achieved through sufficient touching of things. And Ruth Ellen observed it all from her place on the blanket in the yard, with the philosophical expression of a person who is already waiting for her brother to learn things the harder way. Silas built a swing for the yard from the cottonwood branch that came down in June, and she would think about this later as one of the images that made the whole summer. The swing hanging from the remaining branch, the afternoon light through the leaves, Thomas Henry in the swing with his hands gripping the rope and his face doing everything faces do when they are free and in motion, and Silas pushing him with a patience that matched the length of the afternoon, and Ruth Ellen on the blanket, and the cattle in the south pasture, and the white house behind them, and the sky above it all. She had been standing in the garden, and she stopped and simply looked at it all for a long time. She was not cataloging it, she was not managing it, she was just seeing it, letting it be real in the seeing. Silas glanced over at her from the swing and caught the expression on her face and smiled. Not the quarter smile of the beginning, the careful one, the full one. She went back to the garden. That fall they hired a proper hand for the first time. A young man of 22 named August who was from a Swedish family in Nebraska, and who was quiet and extraordinarily hardworking, and who Silas identified in town at the feed store by the way he handled a 50-pound sack of grain, which is apparently how you tell. August lived in the barn room and ate supper with the family twice a week, and was consistently mortified by the children's interest in him, which endeared him to everyone. With August's help, the fall work was done in good time, and the winter preparations were complete by October, which gave them something they had not had in the falls before: margin. Actual margin, days that were not entirely consumed by survival preparation, time that was not wholly borrowed from some future exhausted version of themselves. They used some of it to ride together, she and Silas, on days when August could watch the children for a few hours, riding the land and the roads beyond it in the good Wyoming fall weather, which is the best of the year if you can enjoy it. They rode to the creek where it widened and dismounted and sat on the bank with the horses standing in the shallows and the cottonwoods doing what cottonwoods do in October, which is turning gold in a way that makes everything else feel secondary. On one such afternoon, sitting beside the creek with her shoulder against his, she said, "Tell me where you thought you were going when you were on that road." He considered this. "I thought I was going to find a job in Laramie," he said, "build something up, maybe eventually have land of my own." He paused. "I thought the most I could hope for was a useful life, something that mattered to the work." She looked at the creek moving over the stones. "And now I think I got it completely wrong about what a useful life is," he said. "Now I think it's this, exactly this. Not the land, though the land is good. This right here." She thought about that morning behind the barn with the broken axe and the failing fence and the exhaustion so deep it had gotten into her bones, and she had thought she had nothing left. She thought about the sound of hooves on the road. She thought about a man on a dark bay horse pulling up and looking at the work that needed doing and saying, simply, "Point me to it." "I had nothing left," she said. "When you rode up, I was standing there with a broken axe handle and I was absolutely done." "I know," he said. "I could see it." "What made you stop?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was being careful with the truth. "The axe handle," he said, "and the fence rail, and the way you were standing." He paused. "And you?" She looked at him. "Something in the way you were standing," he said. "Even that tired. There was something in you that wasn't giving up. You were giving out, but you weren't giving up. I wanted to be close to that, whatever that was." She held this for a while, the creek moving and the horses shifting in the shallows. "I almost quit," she said. "I was thinking about quitting. I was standing there with the axe and I was thinking, I have nothing left, and then I heard your horse on the road." "Good timing," he said. "The best timing," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the October afternoon held them in its gold, and they stayed until the light changed, and the air got its first real bite of evening cold. And then they rode home together across the land that was theirs, toward the white house with the light already warm in the kitchen window, where August was making supper with the children underfoot, toward the life they had built together from the pieces that had been scattered on the ground when they found each other. The years turned the way years do on the frontier, each one with its own particular character, and its share of difficulty and beauty and ordinary days that are the most valuable kind. Thomas Henry grew into a rangy, curious boy who was, as Silas had predicted, drawn to the cattle and the horses with a seriousness that looked like vocation, and who read every book in the house twice before he was 10, and then wanted more books, which Clara and Robert sent regularly from Laramie's growing library collection. Ruth Ellen grew into exactly what the observation in her infant eyes had promised, a child of considerable internal life and decided opinions, and a gift for understanding people that Susanna recognized with a complex of emotions that included pride and a slight protective concern. August stayed. He was, by 1888, essentially part of the household in the way that people become part of things when they have stayed long enough for the property to have shaped around them. He had brought his younger sister to Wyoming in 1887, a girl named Hannah of 20 years who spoke careful English with Swedish undertones and who had a laugh that carried across a yard. And she eventually worked with the Harlow family to the north, and she and Thomas Henry met at the Harlow Spring Gathering of 1895 when Thomas Henry was 11 and Hannah was 24, and he shook her hand very seriously and told her about the cattle operation with the earnest completeness of a boy who wants to impress, and she listened without laughing, which he remembered for years. In 1889, Wyoming became a state, and Susanna stood on the porch with Silas and the children when the news came and felt something large and complicated, because statehood meant law more fully present, which meant both protection and intrusion, and it meant the land was changing in its fundamental character. The open range was closing. The big cattle outfits were consolidating. The small homesteaders' advantage, the ability to know their land better than anyone, was more important now than ever. They were fine. They had built something that could weather the changes because they had built it from the ground up. Every board and fence post, and healed relationship between the land and the people on it. The Walker Ranch was known in the territory as a well-run outfit, which was the highest compliment in cattle country, and it was known because Silas Walker ran it with the same methodical reliability he had brought to that first day of work, and because Susanna Walker had the kind of deep knowledge of land and cattle that only comes from having bet everything on understanding both. On the evening of the 28th of June, 1897 years to the month from the day Silas had ridden up the road and pulled up his horse outside her barn, Susanna and Silas sat on the porch in the two chairs after the children were in bed and August had retired to his cabin, which Silas had built him proper 3 years earlier, and the summer evening was long and light and quiet. They were not young the way they had been young. They were in their early 40s, Susanna 40 and Silas 42, and the years of hard outdoor work had given them both the look of people who have spent their time honestly. His dark hair had gone to salt and pepper at the temples, and she liked it. Her chestnut hair was the same color it had always been, and he liked it. Neither of them said this in so many words, but it was said. 7 years, she said. He looked at her. 7 years, he said. She rocked her chair slowly. The sound of the crickets was enormous in the summer night, the great insect chorus of the plains that she had come to love as one of Wyoming's finest sounds. When you rode up that day, she said, I almost told you to keep riding. I know you almost did, he said. What would you have done if I had? He considered this with the honest attention he brought to hypothetical questions. Kept riding, he said. I wouldn't have pressed. He paused. But I would have thought about you all the way to Laramie and probably for a long time after, she smiled. Good answer. It's the true one, he said. They're the same thing with you, she said. That was what I saw in your face that first day. You looked like a man who doesn't separate those. Don't most people? No, she said plainly. They don't. He reached across the space between the chairs and she took his hand, which was as familiar and solid as anything she had ever held, more worn than it had been 7 years ago and warmer somehow, or maybe that was her. Maybe she received the warmth differently now. Thomas Henry coughed once in his room and settled. Ruth Ellen was completely silent in the way of children who sleep with great conviction. August's cabin was dark. The cattle were quiet in the south pasture. The barn stood solid and white-painted in the long summer dusk. Do you miss Ohio? He asked. He asked this sometimes, not anxiously, just with curiosity, the way a person asks about the parts of someone they were not present for. Not the way I thought I would, she said. I miss Clara being closer, though she's only 12 miles away. I miss my father sometimes, but Ohio itself, no. This is where I live. This is where I am. She looked out at the land, the hills going blue in the dusk, the sky doing its extravagant thing. Thomas chose this land because the price was right, she said, as she had said once before. I stayed because of the sky, and then you stayed. And I stayed because of you, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the sky too, but then he looked at her, and 7 years had not altered what was between them, and that looking had only deepened it, the way ground water deepens a spring, more constant, more reliable, more true. You should know, she said quietly, that you gave me my life back. I don't say it because you need to hear it. I say it because it's true and you deserve to know it. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that receives something rather than dismisses it. You had your life, he said. You were keeping it, you were doing it with everything you had. I just came down the road, she said. Came down the road, he agreed. She held his hand, and the night came down around them, gently, over the Walker Ranch on the Wyoming high plains, over the white house and the sound barn and the good fence lines and the south pasture, and the kitchen garden and the greenhouse where tomatoes grew against all reasonable expectation, over the 2 sleeping children and the hired man in his cabin and the horses in the paddock and the cattle along the creek. Over all of it that had been built from a broken axe handle and a fence rail down, and a woman who was done but not giving up, and a man on a dark bay horse who had pulled up at the right moment on the right road and said, "Point me to the work." The night was enormous and clear. The stars were out in their full Wyoming number, which is a number that makes you feel both small and part of something so much larger than yourself that the smallness becomes irrelevant. Silas and Susanna Walker sat on their porch in their 2 chairs and held hands in the dark, and the crickets sang, and the land was theirs. They stayed until the lantern oil was almost gone, and then they went inside together, and the door closed quietly behind them, and the house held its warmth against the Wyoming night, and the stars moved over it in their ancient, slow, indifferent, beautiful course. And the Fairchild land, Walker land, their land, hard-won and loved and permanent as anything on this earth, gets to be rested beneath it all, solid and real, going nowhere.